Hey, it's Chris, Liege Games. Let's do this. So today we're talking about something completely different that is probably off your radar, but is worth talking about because it's a different venture into the board game scene altogether from a publisher, from an IP standpoint. And that's because this is Anna's Roundtable, the Fire Emblem board game. And if that doesn't ring a bell, well, it probably wouldn't for a lot of you because it's not widely distributed. It's self-published, which nowadays non-crowdfunding self-published is relatively rare. Let's talk about this game, why I think it's important, what you need to know about it, and whether or not you should be looking at it as, one, the future of gaming. Are we going to see more of it? But also, is it right for you, and should you be picking it up regardless? So let's do this. This is a very interesting take on a board game. This board game brings up a lot of important issues for our hobby. And it may not seem like it. It may just seem like another mass market retail IP insert here money grab. But let me be very clear from Brother Ming Games. This is a passion project. This is by many, many, many people. If you're not familiar with it, Brother Ming Games basically crowdsourced the art on all of the individual cards in this game. And so every card, especially all the hero characters that you're using, and let me be very clear, there are a ton of them. I have never seen a card game probably in my life that has this many asymmetric independent cards, and almost all of them are done by different artists from online, and they all get credit at the bottom of their card, which is really cool. Right? So the art style, again, this is not going to appeal to a lot of people when you look at that, but you see it all over the art. And so that is an amazing thing that people did. And that has to be first noticed. And the second point that goes right along with this is a self-published, self-made, in the sense that they didn't go through somebody else, they didn't crowdfund it. You know, they had pre-orders on their website and then they just printed them based on that. And we don't see a whole lot of that anymore. In the printing on demand, essentially, was what it was. And it raises the very interesting point of, are we going to see a lot more of this type of situation in the future? Now, obviously, this is an IP. This is not like a licensed IP, and I'm not going to go into that. There's plenty of debate about that on the Board Game Geek forums, and they address all of it there, and so I'm not going to touch on that. But if you're not familiar with what Fire Emblem is, let's talk about Fire Emblem, and let's go into that a little bit more, just so that you know the context of this game. Fire Emblem is this fantasy tactical role-playing game developed by a company called Intelligent Systems and published through Nintendo. This is a long-spanning series since like 1980. A total of 16 games plus 4 spin-offs so far. The closest thing that I would compare it to is something along the lines of Final Fantasy Tactics, which more lay casual people are more familiar with on the video game side of things. It uses the same grid-based environments while incorporating the story that you're more familiar with and the overarching premise and the scenario-based missions that you're going to be dealing with. Now, this game is different also because it has the Final Fantasy Tactics version, but if you die, you lose that character forever. And so it adds sort of a permadeath approach to the Final Fantasy-esque games with the hex or grid-based environment that we don't typically see in the westernized versions of these types of games, which again, for the hardcore, for the very interested, for the decisions matter, tactics matter, not just run and slug, is something different, which is part of the popularity along with all of the IP and the lore to go along with it. And now, so you are incorporating this into a board game, right? And this is, for all intents, more of a one versus one strategic dueler where you are fighting over an area that you are trying to capture or land on a castle point and hold it during your turn in order to score victory points. You can also score victory points by knocking out your opponent's heroes, but it is significantly less. Picking off that, I mean, this is definitely an IP that is although not widely known, still well thought of in the video gaming circles. And so it's no surprise that eventually, as I have said numerous times over the last year and a half, that more video game properties are going to be incorporated into board games. It's just this is slightly different than you may have expected originally, especially with the mass appeal now of plastic and plastic on a board. And this strays away from that, which is a very positive aspect. The concept itself is relatively simple and straightforward, but it is very nuanced in its approach. You have your character board, where you are going to be drawing cards of one of three colors. A fourth we'll talk about in a second: red, green, and blue. It does the classic sort of pluses and minuses depending on which color it is, sort of paper, scissors, rock. Now there's also gray, which can be put in any slot, but then obviously occupies a slot where you can only have 3 on the board to begin with, so you're going to be losing out on one of those individual colors. You add in some legendary characters, which you can only have 1 on the board in the first place, where you get double victory points when you knock them out. And again, it sort of writes itself a little bit in that sense. The other aspect of this is the cards and the characters and the heroes that I mentioned in and of themselves. I am not kidding when I say this is probably the largest amount of cards I have seen. The only thing that even is comparable is Red Rising from Stonemaier Games, with a deck like this that is unique. But I kid you not, that this deck is like this. And let me be very clear. This is massive. Now, most of these are heroes. I think the top portion here are, a little bit of enemies and a little items, but this portion right here, almost the size of my index finger, and I'm struggling to grip in one hand, and I'm probably going to drop it at some point to mess this up, but that is a ton. And therein lies one of the biggest points of this game, is it's almost too much in a good way. You almost have too many cards, because when you have a deck that is literally stretching my hand out, you are inevitably, both in a positive for the people that crave variability and replayability, not going to end up with the same cards or anywhere near the same combination of cards ever. But you're also not going to be able to mitigate it and control what you get as much. And so, if you get a game where you're drawing a lot of greens or you're getting a lot of reds, it's going to be a little harder to get that blue that you maybe want. Now, it gives you mechanics to mitigate that a little bit in terms of being able to discard cards, but there is some of that where you have less control over your situation in a nutshell, strategy-wise, and you have to be more tactical in terms of which cards you're going to be putting out, because you have a hand of 6 cards of 6 heroes that you have at your disposal at any one time that you can fill one of those 3 character slots up with. Now, obviously, the gray character that I talked about, you can slide in between slots as you draw other characters, so it doesn't get slotted or stuck in one, but it still takes up a spot until they're knocked out. So that is both a blessing and a curse. You could make the argument that sheer volume is not always the best thing. And now, again, what do you want? If you are a Fire Emblem purist, if you are a Fire Emblem lore master, this is going to appeal to you. If you are the tight board game control mechanic person, this may be slightly less appealing than some of the other dueling games that are similar to this ilk, whether that be the more recent Radlands and Sakura Arms, or that is more BattleCon Exceed Yomi, where you slightly know, especially with the first 2 there, BattleCon and Exceed, what you're going to be able to get. One of the things that is, I think, overall a little bit detrimental for this game in that sense is there are too many keywords. There is literally the pamphlet of the foldout here. Literally, the player aid here is a pamphlet foldout. Not that that is bad. This is actually really nice. But when you look at this foldout and you flip it over to the backside and you get this list of all of the characteristics, if you will, of the characters, there are about 22 of them. And some of them are very, easy. Versus shifter, you get +2 attack versus combat with a shifter. Versus armor, get +2 attack versus combat with an armored unit. But some of these, grab, physic, reposition, shove are slightly nuanced in how they are different in terms of the movements of how they can affect other characters. And then you have another 12 or so passive that are all slightly different as well. And so it's not so much that the individual ones are hard, but when you are looking across the board at the other person and their 3 cards, it's hard to tell. It's hard to remind yourself always when each of them have about 3 or 4. Which one is which and how does that correspond to the board? And it's a lot of overhead there that is a little bit sort of detrimental to the smoothness or the ease of accessibility when you're trying to teach it to other people. I mean, that was my biggest problem with trying to play it with my wife, was keeping track and having her remember which one of those, because battles in this sense are swung and won or lost by the use of some of these terms as you're going about that. And again, the character cards in that sense, when you have so many of them, there are just slight variations here or there, and there are some cool powers and there are some slightly less useful ones. I mean, that's by the nature of only having so many of these, or having so many in the first place. There is going to be some overlap. There is not going to be, although there are unique characters, names, there is some overlap in terms of the powers and the abilities and that. So you're going to see some similarities, whether it's a red or blue, a green, or a gray. The items are a very nice addition, and they make the units slightly different, and they come in very tactically handy. And so the ability to use your coins that you're acquiring on a turn-by-turn basis, because if you can't fight on the map, for say, you can work and get an extra coin or two depending on where you are on the map in order to buy said items of the 3 different types of items that you can have. Which again is slightly different because the items are presented to you face down instead of face up. So you're buying blind in a way. Now, the next interesting point on this, point 2, point 3, wherever we're at in that sense, is the fact that I said at the beginning of this video was this game is slightly less about knocking out your opponent like those other games that I mentioned between Yomi, Battlecon, Exceed, Sakura Arms. And it's more about capturing the castle in and of itself, because capturing the castle earns you anywhere from 4 to 9 victory points, which is you get one of the cards, and when all of the cards are gone, that is one way that the game ends. Whereas knocking out your opponent's character may only earn you 1 or even 2 if it's a heroic character. So it's a big point discrepancy. So it's a little bit more area control tactical nature, which, to be fair, going back to the Fire Emblem IP, right? It's not, at its core, a slug 'em out fighter game. It is a very balanced, tactical, nuanced game where you are rewarded for better tactics, and that is encompassed in the victory conditions in this game. There is a boss mode as well that goes along with this, which I think is a very nice addition, because not only then can you play this competitively, but I sort of wish at times I could play Exceed cooperatively against a boss. Sort of what they did with Dice Throne, if you will. It's got the Dice Throne individual and the Dice Throne altogether, Dice Throne Adventures packed into it as well, where you can go head to head against a boss on a similar map with an AI system. So what do I think of this game after having played it and comparing it to those others that I mentioned? It's different. It is more probably similar to Dice Throne and Dice Throne Adventures than any of those others that I mentioned. And with the capturing and the strategy on the map itself mattering more than just the bash 'em up, hit 'em up, it's going to be appealing to a different audience than, say, the more perfect-ish information lovers of those other dueling type games. And you have to mention the price point. And the pre-order was something around the fact of $90, which again goes back to the beginning of an independent publisher publishing their own game based on pre-orders. There are extra copies available now that it's being distributed and shipped out to all the pre-orders. They are going on Brother Ming Games' website for $100. And that has to be considered. If you are a big fan of the IP, there's going to be nothing else out there like this in terms of the capturing on the map as opposed to the just pure tactical battling. But I have to make the argument at the same time, for $100, you could get a full season of Exceed or Radlands, a box of Exceed, a box of Battlecon, and maybe a box of Sakura Arms, and see which one fits you the best. And that's not insignificant. So as much as I applaud the independent publishing, you know, it's definitely going to be a pricier product, and you have to be willing and wanting this from one of those aspects in order for it to fit in your collection with so much stiff competition out there to begin with. What does it do well? Again, I think it captures the essence of Fire Emblem in the sense that you are not just rough and tumble, slugging it out, trying to KO the most people on the other team the fastest. I think it does a good job of showing what you can do on a map as a dueler, something different, along with the boss mode, which was something, you know, I wasn't expecting to like in that sense, but works well. Another element that I think is done exceptionally well, and I wish would be done in more games, is when you capture one of those castle spots, or when you knock out an opponent's character, you get victory points, but they get a reward in the form of something called a dragon vein, which essentially is a catch-up mechanic to balance things out. Can be used to get various power-ups in order to play your cards faster, or to do certain things like even change the terrain on the board. And so that is a great aspect. That is probably one of the biggest game-changing aspects that you are not going to see in many other places. Along with that, the combat system where I attack you, if you're in range, you attack me back, but then also the fastest person gets a second attack, potentially, which totally changes the mindset of how you're going to attack someone. And I lost many a battle not realizing that I was going to lose the counter attack, essentially, when I thought I could cripple them with the initial attack. So those aspects are just superbly done. One thing that I did not think was as done, as I mentioned previously, is the keywords. Just too many. They aren't necessarily making as big of impact all the time. If you could eliminate maybe a third of them or a quarter of them and just streamline it and make the ones that are there slightly more meaningful, slightly more powerful. And again, from a balancing standpoint, I know that's easier said than done, but I think it would add that much more, because then you're not having to worry about the overhead of the 4 that your opponent has on each of their 3 characters and which one is there and how is it going to affect things. And because there's some element of that if you just can't remember, then it's not going to be fun when they just go, aha, gotcha, I have this ability on this one. And even though it's in plain sight, you just don't remember it and can't get to it and figure it out. I think, again, then in the same aspect, what we see with some of the biggest companies on the crowdfunding scene, Awaken Realms and, Simon, to use their examples here, sometimes less is more. Sometimes I don't need, 600 of, the zombies that are very similar. Sometimes I want just very unique, very purposeful, very different ones. And that is just one thing I think that presents a harder challenge to get this game played from that aspect. All in all, though, I think the biggest take-home message of this is, if you can do it with this, it means that other people, if you have a good enough concept, are willing to support you on non-crowdfunding, non-major game company websites or funding. And I think as a hobby, we need to start being open to that, because whether it's a crowdfunded game or not, this is a positive aspect of our hobby that needs to be explored, because there's less FOMO and less necessarily bling that this brings in a good way. So there you go. Those are my thoughts on Anna's Roundtable, the Fire Emblem board game from Brother Ming Games. Let me know if you have any comments, questions, or concerns down below. As always, if you made it this far, please smash the like button. Let other people experience the wonder of Liege of Games, and we'll go from there. Click subscribe if you're not too. That'd be awesome. Stay classy. Have a great day. I'll see you around.